Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're curled beneath the covers, or tracing the edge of your pillow with sleepy fingers. Maybe the lights are already dimmed, the world outside quiet, and your thoughts beginning to drift like leaves in a soft stream. Tonight, you are not just falling asleep. You're stepping into a place between silence and story, between the stars above and the whispers below. In the world of Percy Jackson, there are many great battles, loud adventures, and roaring monsters. But somewhere behind all that noise, there is something older, something softer, something far more powerful. Prophecy, a whisper that comes before the war, a breath that brushes past the ear of a hero, long before their blade is drawn. These are not just predictions. They are lullabies wrapped in riddles, dreams disguised as warnings, and destinies hiding in rhymes. And tonight, we're going to listen to them, not to fear them, not to fight them, but simply to let them drift around us like ancient mist. You see, in the beginning, long before Percy held his sword, there was an oracle. Not just any oracle, but one cursed to speak only when the weight of fate demanded it. She was once a mortal girl, chosen by Apollo to carry his words. But the gift became a burden. When she denied a god's love, she was cursed to speak truths she could never stop and never shape. Truths that bent time. Truths that could twist a child's life into legend or tragedy. She lives in the heart of Camp Half-Blood. Or rather, something of her does. A dry, hollow voice that crawls from deep within the old attic, in a house that always creaks a little too loud when you're trying to sleep. That attic smells of dust, ancient scrolls, and a past that never quite sleeps. And if you ever climb the stairs at night, barefoot, heart trembling, you might feel that moment where the air shifts. Like someone is watching, not with malice, just with waiting. Because that's what prophecy is. It waits. It listens for the heartbeat of heroes not yet born. And when the moment is right, it speaks. But not like we speak. No. Prophecy curls around your spine like wind on a mountaintop. It doesn't shout. It sings. In riddles. In rhymes. In verses that seem harmless until they come true. The oracle has waited in silence before. For years. Decades. Waiting for a child of the big three. Waiting for Percy. But we'll get to that. For now, let the idea settle gently in your mind, like a blanket laid over your thoughts. There are stories you know, and stories you've only felt. And prophecy, it lives in both. Somewhere between memory and mystery. It doesn't always tell the truth the way we want it. Sometimes it tells the truth in symbols, in shadows, in lines like a half-blood of the eldest gods shall reach 16 against all odds. That line alone kept gods awake, kept monsters lurking, kept heroes wondering, is it me? And maybe you, listening right now, wondering about your own choices, your own future. Maybe you felt it too, that quiet tug, that strange feeling that something is pulling you forward, gently, even when you don't know where you're going. That's how it begins. That's how every prophecy begins. Not with lightning, not with battle cries, but with a hush. And so, let's start tonight with hush, with the quiet before the storm. Let me tell you these stories not as battles, but as dreams. Let me tell you about the voice that echoes before swords are drawn, about the quiet girl who became the voice of the gods, about the campfires where demigods whisper verses they barely understand, about the lines that changed everything. And as you listen, you don't need to solve anything. There's no riddle to crack here tonight, no monster to fight, no fate to change, just words, just rhythm, just ancient voices curling into the air like mist on a lake. So breathe with me, slowly. Inhale, exhale. Let the past speak softly. Let the future sleep a while longer. And if you hear something tonight that stirs something inside you, something familiar and unspoken, don't be afraid. That's just the lullaby of prophecy. It hums in all of us, even you, even now. But what is a prophecy really? Is it a warning, a riddle, a trap? Or maybe it's something simpler, something older than fear. The ancient Greeks believed in fate, in the three fates to be exact. Clotho, who spun the thread of life, Lachesis, who measured it, and Atropos, who snipped it. And even the gods themselves feared those three. Even Zeus, the king of thunder, would glance nervously at a mortal's thread, knowing he could not lengthen or shorten it. He could only shape what happened in between. Prophecies. They are glimpses of that thread. They are the tug before the storm, a feeling in the chest, or a dream you can't explain. In the world of Percy Jackson, these visions come through the oracle, but not always all at once. Sometimes a prophecy arrives in pieces. Sometimes it hides in dreams. Sometimes it waits inside a child's heart until the moment is just right. And when it does speak, it doesn't care if you're ready. It doesn't ask if you're brave, or scared, or good, or bad. It simply speaks. Imagine it like a song echoing across centuries. An old lullaby passed from one hero to the next, sung in 1,000 different voices, always with the same hush, the same melody, the same pull. The demigods at Camp Half-Blood learn early. If the oracle calls your name, your path is no longer your own. You may live, you may die, but your story will matter. And yet, there's something deeply peaceful about that. Because a prophecy isn't chaos. It's structure. It's proof that the universe is listening, that the gods are watching, that even in a world filled with monsters and betrayal and impossible odds, your journey is part of something bigger. And when you finally understand that, when you truly feel it, it brings a strange kind of calm. That's why tonight, we don't fear these stories. We don't race through them or fight against their meaning. We lie still. We listen. And as you listen, you may notice that some prophecies rhyme and others don't. Some are short, sharp, like a spark in the dark. Others stretch across years, sagas of fate unfolding piece by piece. The ones you'll hear tonight, they come from every corner of Percy's world. Some from Camp Half-Blood, others from the Roman camp, from ancient temples, and even from dreams that never fully woke. Some came true, others never did. And some are still waiting, somewhere in the fog between sleep and story. You'll hear the tale of a girl who turned into a tree to escape her fate. A boy who ran from destiny for years before realizing he'd been running toward it all along. A girl with no godly parent at all, chosen to carry the voice of every god in one single breath. You'll learn of a new generation who carried a second great prophecy, one even heavier than the first. And in between these stories, we'll drift gently into questions that don't need answers. Questions like, if you saw a vision of your own death, would you walk into it, or would you change the path? And if you did change the path, was that change always part of the vision? We won't answer that here. That's not what tonight is for. Tonight is for breathing, for feeling, for floating gently on the edge of time. And now, as you settle deeper into stillness, let your thoughts soften. Let the flickers of campfire light fill your imagination. Picture the attic of the big house once more. Dusty, silent, ancient. Picture the mummified form of the old oracle girl, sitting motionless, forever frozen in time, her empty eye sockets gazing not at you, but through you, waiting for the next child who dares to climb the stairs, waiting for the next name the gods will whisper. That moment, the silence before a voice emerges, is what we're stepping into now. Because long ago, before the world knew his name, before the sword, before the sea, before Olympus trembled at his choice, a boy named Percy Jackson stood unknowingly at the edge of fate. He was the son of one of the big three, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, gods who had sworn long ago never to bear children again. The world had barely survived the last time they did. But fate doesn't care for oaths. And when Percy was born, the silence that had hung over the attic of the big house broke. A new prophecy was spoken, one that would echo for years, one that would change everything, one that would mark the beginning of a journey so vast, so tangled with choice and sacrifice and love and power, that even the gods held their breath. That prophecy began as all lullabies do, with a single line, a soft verse, a whisper in the dark. A half-blood of the eldest gods shall reach 16 against all odds. And now, as the stars above grow brighter and the mist begins to part, let us drift quietly into that first true prophecy, into the story of a child of the big three and the storm he was born to weather. It began with silence, not the quiet of sleep, but the heavy silence of waiting. For decades, the attic of the big house remained undisturbed, just dust, shadows, and the dry rustle of old memories. The oracle, cursed and mummified, sat unmoving, untouched, unspeaking. Until one night, in a storm that rolled across Long Island like the voice of fate itself, she whispered again. The words came not with thunder, but with stillness. They arrived not as warning, but as inevitability. Chiron, the immortal trainer of heroes, heard them first, his hooves pausing on the stairs, his breath held as the ancient voice echoed once more from that forgotten place. A half-blood of the eldest gods shall reach 16 against all odds. It was the first line of a prophecy that would change the course of Olympus and of the mortal world. And at that time, no one knew which child it meant, because many years earlier, after the Second World War, a pact had been made, sworn upon the river Styx, sealed in divine blood. The big three, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, had watched their children tear the world apart, watched the rise and fall of Hitler and Hirohito, and the tragedies that followed, and had made a vow. No more children with mortals. No more demigods born of their power. Because the children of the big three were too strong, too unpredictable. They brought war wherever they went. And for a while, the gods kept their word. The world grew quiet. The oracle grew still. But the fates are not so easily fooled. Promises mean little when destiny begins to twist. And somewhere in the gentle spray of sea foam off the coast of Montauk, Poseidon, ancient god of the ocean, older than Olympus itself, broke his oath. He met a mortal woman named Sally Jackson. She was kind, brave, and when the world looked away, he gave her a son. That child's name was Perseus, Percy Jackson. But for 12 years, the gods kept their distance. Percy grew up in the mortal world, his divine nature carefully hidden. And in that time, 2 other children of the big three were born: Thalia, daughter of Zeus, and Nico, son of Hades. The world did not know them yet, but destiny had begun to stir, weaving threads that could not remain tangled for long. Back at Camp Half-Blood, the prophecy sat like a weight in the room. Chiron guarded it closely. The gods were watching. Everyone knew what the lines meant. If a child of the big three survived to the age of 16, they would face a choice that could save Olympus or destroy it. A half-blood of the eldest gods shall reach 16 against all odds, and see the world in endless sleep. The next line was even more haunting. Endless sleep, a phrase that didn't mean death, not directly, but something heavier. A silence across the world, a stillness in the soul. It could mean mass destruction, or worse, obedience, oppression, surrender. The words were vague, as prophecy often is, the kind of riddle you don't understand until it's too late. But still, the prophecy didn't stop there. The hero's soul, cursed blade shall reap, a blade that would kill the hero, or be wielded by the hero, or perhaps do both. And then finally, a single choice shall end his days, Olympus to preserve or raise. One choice, one moment, one decision that would determine the fate of gods and mortals alike. And no one knew who the prophecy spoke of. At first, Chiron suspected Thalia. She was strong, wild, and powerful. But fate, as always, intervened. Thalia died, sort of. She was turned into a pine tree by her father, Zeus, in a last desperate act of protection. And so, the prophecy's focus shifted. For years, the world was quiet, until Percy came to camp. And suddenly, everything began to move. Monsters sensed him. Gods whispered of omens. The mist swirled thick around his path. And one by one, the clues began to align. Percy was 12. He was unclaimed. But the sea spoke to him, literally. Water obeyed him. And then, Poseidon claimed him. A trident burned over Percy's head in the middle of the dining pavilion, and gasps echoed like thunder. The pact had been broken. The prophecy had found its name. Percy didn't know what any of it meant. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want fate or glory or power. He just wanted to protect his mother, to understand why his life never quite fit. But fate doesn't wait for readiness, and in the years that followed, Percy would be tested again and again. First with the theft of Zeus's master bolt, then in the sea of monsters, then into the depths of Tartarus. And always, always, that prophecy waited, like a ticking clock in the background of every battle. The closer Percy came to 16, the louder it echoed. The blade, the choice, the soul, endless sleep. And then came the war. Kronos, the Titan Lord of Time, returned, possessing the body of Luke Castellan, a son of Hermes. The prophecy twisted once again, revealing new angles. Maybe it wasn't Percy who was meant to destroy Olympus. Maybe it was Luke. Maybe Percy's choice wasn't just about saving the gods, but about trusting his greatest enemy. But we'll come to that later. For now, picture this. A teenage boy standing on the edge of Manhattan, watching the Empire State Building glow with the fires of Olympus, knowing that he holds a decision in his hands that could bring it all down. Not with a sword, not with war, but with trust, with belief, with surrender. The kind of choice prophecy never spells out clearly, because prophecy doesn't care how the world changes, only that it does. And in the heart of the big house attic, where the oracle sleeps once more, the air grows still. One prophecy spoken, one destiny fulfilled. But its echoes remain. They always do, even now, as the next prophecy begins to stir. And yet, even as the years passed and the battles multiplied, Percy never fully understood what it meant to be the subject of a prophecy. He felt it more than he knew it, like a shadow always just behind him, brushing his shoulder whenever he made a choice, whispering in his ear at every crossroads. There was no handbook for being chosen, no training for carrying a line of destiny etched across your soul before you were even born. Percy fought monsters, yes. He challenged gods. He survived betrayal and pain and loss. But the heaviest thing he ever carried was not his sword. It was that single prophecy, wound like a second spine through his story. Because what people often forget is that prophecy doesn't speak in straight lines. It doesn't arrive like a map. It curls and loops and hides its meanings beneath layers of doubt. And Percy, brave, impulsive, loyal to a fault, had to live with that weight every day. Each victory brought him closer to 16. Each mistake narrowed the path. And all the while, Olympus trembled, not knowing if he would save them or bring the sky crashing down. But Percy was never alone. Annabeth watched the prophecy with calculating fear, trying to outsmart it before it turned cruel. Grover watched with worry in his eyes, always wondering if this quest would be their last. And the gods, they watched too, from their thrones in the heavens, whispering in immortal tongues, hoping the hero they feared most would be the one to save them. Because by the time Percy turned 16, the world was on fire. Kronos had risen. The Titan army marched across America, toppling minor gods, destroying sacred places. Olympus had abandoned its throne, every god off fighting battles at the edges of the world, leaving Mount Olympus empty and exposed. Only the demigods remained. Camp Half-Blood, the last defense. And Percy, the only child of the big three left standing in the right place at the right time. He didn't want the prophecy. He didn't crave the spotlight. But when the sky began to fall, he didn't run. He stood beneath it, not for glory, not even for Olympus, but for his friends, for Annabeth, for the idea that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than what the prophecy demanded. And so, in the final battle, deep within the heart of Manhattan, as Kronos surged inside Luke's body and Olympus burned above, Percy made a choice. He gave the blade to Luke, the cursed blade, the one that would end it all. Because Percy realized something no one else had. The prophecy was never about him. It was about the choice. And Luke, flawed, broken, bitter Luke, was the only one who could make it. The hero's soul, the cursed blade, the single choice. Luke struck his own heart, and with that, fulfilled the line that had haunted them all for so long. Olympus was saved. Percy survived. But more importantly, Percy chose to let go of the spotlight, to trust, to let someone else be the hero. That's the part people often miss. That the greatest act of heroism isn't always to fight. It's to understand, to step aside, to see clearly. And so the great prophecy was fulfilled, not with a war cry, but with a whisper, with a soft surrender, with a trust placed in the most unlikely hands. And after that, the attic grew quiet again. The oracle's voice dimmed. The prophecy faded into legend. But echoes remain, always. Because when a prophecy ends, something else begins. A new stirring, a new voice, a new rhythm in the air. And far beyond the walls of Camp Half-Blood, in the western lands where old winds still carry secrets, another verse began to rise. A second great prophecy, one born not of a single hero, but of seven. Seven who would rise together, seven who would fall together, seven who would change the world again. And as Percy tried to rest, tired, aged far beyond his years, the words came like an echo of old fears wrapped in new hope. 7 half-bloods shall answer the call. And so, the story continues. When you think of a hero fulfilling a prophecy, you might imagine something loud, an explosion, a sword raised in triumph, a roar that echoes across mountaintops. But Percy Jackson's destiny didn't arrive like that. His prophecy, the one he had carried since childhood, came to its quiet crescendo not in the heat of glory, but in the stillness between breaths. In the hush that falls before a city breaks. In the soft tremble of choice. Because the truth is, most of Percy's journey had never been about the prophecy. Not really. He didn't wake up each morning thinking, what fate waits for me today? He thought about Annabeth's worried eyes. He thought about Grover's loyalty. He thought about monsters, of course, too many to count, and his mom, who had given everything to protect him. What loomed over him, like a cloud just out of sight, was never the specific words of the oracle. It was the feeling that something big, something final, was always coming. And when it did, when Kronos rose in the form of Luke, when Manhattan went dark and Olympus was left unguarded, it didn't feel like a moment of glory. It felt like the world had stopped holding its breath. It began in silence, just like the prophecy. The gods were gone, off fighting Typhon, that monstrous storm in the west. The mortals had been lulled into sleep. Kronos' forces swarmed to New York. Camp Half-Blood had prepared for this, but nothing prepares you for war. They set up barricades, posted sentries, drew battle lines. But Percy, newly turned 16, knew that strategy would only carry them so far. What mattered now wasn't who had the most power, but who had the most to lose. And Percy, he had everything to lose. Annabeth was beside him. She wasn't just a friend anymore. He didn't know what they were yet, but he knew that if she fell, something inside him would break that no sword could fix. And Grover, still wild-eyed, still gentle, stood ready to defend the city, even though he could barely hold a blade. The others came too. Clarice, Tyson, Selena. Beckendorf was already gone. His sacrifice had bought them time, but not peace. So Percy led them, not because he was the strongest, but because they believed in him. That's what destiny looks like sometimes. Not someone shouting from the front, but someone standing still while the world shakes, refusing to step aside. The battle came in waves. Dracaeni slithered down Broadway. Giants crushed through Soho. Bridges collapsed. The air turned black with smoke and fear. But Percy fought. He fought with water, with rage, with heartbreak. And slowly, the prophecy carved itself into the stone around them. A half-blood of the eldest gods. That was him. There was no more debate. Shall reach 16. He had. The day had come. Against all odds, and the odds had been many. Betrayal, monsters, gods who feared him. And still, he stood. And see the world in endless sleep. That line felt too close, too real. As Kronos' voice rang from the Empire State Building, Percy could feel the pull of that sleep. Not just the literal one, but the deeper one. The kind that comes when hope is lost, when the world gives in. The hero's soul, cursed blade shall reap. What was the cursed blade? Anaklusmos? Luke's sword? Something unseen? Every step forward brought more doubt. That's the cruel genius of prophecy. It doesn't tell you how, only what. And the final line. A single choice shall end his days, Olympus to preserve or raise. The choice, it was coming. Percy didn't know when or how, or even what it would look like. But he knew it would not be made in a flash of lightning. It would be smaller, quieter, and it came, in a moment that no one expected. Kronos stood before him, wearing Luke's body like armor. His eyes gleamed with gold and power, but somewhere inside, Luke was still there, trapped, screaming. Annabeth had seen it. She had believed. And when the final blow was set to fall, Percy stopped. He looked into the eyes of his greatest enemy and saw not a monster, but a boy, a friend, a warning, a reflection of what he could have become. And he made the choice. He handed Luke the blade, the cursed blade, the blade that had drawn so much blood. And Luke, broken, poisoned, furious at the gods, made his own choice. He struck his own heart. The prophecy came true. The hero's soul, the cursed blade, the single choice. Olympus did not fall, but it did not rise unchanged. Percy had preserved it, yes, but only by trusting the one person everyone had given up on. And that trust, that impossible act of mercy, was what the prophecy had meant all along. Because sometimes preserving something means letting go. Sometimes saving the world means not being the one to strike. That is the hidden magic of prophecy. It doesn't just predict the future. It shapes who you become as you move toward it. Percy could have let the prophecy define him. He could have become cold, obsessed with power, consumed with fear, but he chose to be something else, to listen, to trust, to let love, not war, guide his hand. And when it was over, the gods returned. Olympus was saved. The throne room glowed with new life, and Percy refused the offer of immortality. He could have lived forever, a hero among heroes, a name whispered for eons. But he asked for something else, for the gods to claim all their children, to promise that no demigod would ever again feel abandoned, that no child would be left alone in the world, hunted by monsters and forgotten by their parent. That was Percy's real victory, not the prophecy's fulfillment, but what came after, the healing, the peace, the rewriting of an ancient cycle. And when he left Olympus, hand in hand with Annabeth, there was no fanfare, no trumpet, just a quiet sunset, just the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. The prophecy was done, but his story wasn't, because even as the fires cooled and Camp Half-Blood rebuilt itself, whispers began again, another stirring, a new dream, a second great prophecy. And as Percy closed his eyes, finally able to sleep without riddles hanging over him, the words came like mist. 7 half-bloods shall answer the call. It was time again. But even after the sky stopped burning and Olympus was saved, Percy Jackson couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had been left behind. Not a threat, not an enemy, but a weight, a whisper still curled at the edge of memory, like a song he used to hum but no longer remembered the words to. He had fulfilled the prophecy. The world had not ended. The gods had bowed their heads in respect, and still something lingered. Perhaps it was because Percy had never asked for any of it. He hadn't wanted to be the chosen one. He hadn't yearned for glory. He had stumbled into destiny like a wave crashing on the wrong shore, swept away by tides older than memory. And even though he had made the right choice in the end, trusting Luke, sparing Olympus, choosing mercy over pride, the journey had taken its toll. Prophecy changes a person, even when it doesn't break them. It weaves into the heart, into the bones, and Percy, though still young, had already lived a life twice folded by fate. After the war, Camp Half-Blood changed. The cabins opened. The gods began to claim their children more readily. Chiron walked with a quieter expression, as if some deep storm had passed. And the oracle, she slept again. The attic once more filled with silence. But the prophecy hadn't only hovered over Percy. Others had felt it too. Thalia Grace, daughter of Zeus, had once stood on the very brink of that same fate. Before Percy ever held a sword, Thalia had fought tooth and nail to survive. She had led demigods across states, defied monsters, clashed with hunters, and nearly died on the hill where the pine tree still grows. Some believed the original prophecy was meant for her, that she was the first child of the big three to draw Olympus's gaze after the oath was made. And maybe she was. Maybe that's why fate turned her into a tree, not as punishment, but as pause, a way to delay destiny, a soft rewrite of what was meant to be. Because had she survived a little longer, had she turned 16, perhaps she would have faced Kronos instead. Perhaps she would have held the cursed blade. perhaps the story would have been hers. And yet, even after she returned to mortal form, even after Artemis offered her a place among the hunters and she stepped away from the aging clock, Thalia still carried the shape of what might have been. The almost hero, the shadow version of a fulfilled prophecy. But she was not the only one. Deep beneath the world, in places forgotten by time, another child waited. A boy with dark eyes and darker burdens. Nico D'Angelo, son of Hades, lost in time and memory. Unlike Percy and Thalia, Nico had not been born in the present world. He had slipped through time, preserved by magic and grief, arriving into an era where nothing made sense and everything was already broken. For a time, he was too young to bear prophecy. But as he grew, the shadows grew with him. And those who watched closely began to wonder, had the prophecy found its true heir? After all, a child of the big three, unclaimed, unseen, unloved. Nico was powerful beyond measure. He spoke to ghosts, commanded death, walked between worlds. And yet, he was not the hero anyone expected. Too strange, too quiet, too wrapped in pain. And yet, so often, it's the quiet ones who hold the threads of fate without anyone noticing. Nico saw what others refused to see. He wandered where others feared to tread. He held truths in his heart that would break others in half. And like Thalia, he carried the outline of a story never fully told. A prophecy that could have been his if the world had shifted just a little differently. And that's the nature of prophecy, isn't it? For every line that comes true, there are 10 others that wait in silence. Potential paths, lost versions, forgotten heroes. It's easy to see Percy as the only chosen one. But behind him stood others, each one just as haunted, just as touched by fate. And though they didn't fulfill the great prophecy, they bore its echo. Thalia in her defiance, Nico in his loneliness. Even Annabeth, though not a child of the big three, lived in prophecy's orbit. Her intelligence, her bravery, her dreams of architecture and rebuilding the world, those two were acts of prophecy in disguise. They didn't need the oracle's voice to shape their paths. Destiny finds many forms. And so, as Percy tried to rest, as the camp quieted, as the world turned once again toward peace, these other heroes walked the edges of the same story. And in the spaces between what was and what might have been, the winds began to shift again. A new stirring, a second great prophecy, one that did not center on a single hero, but on many. 7 half-bloods, not all Greek, not all willing, but bound together by words written long before they were born. And in this next story, it is Thalia's legacy, Nico's pain, and Percy's peace that drift quietly into the background. Because now the prophecy waits for others, for new voices, new choices, and new paths. And yet, as we step into these shadows, we must remember the ones who almost carried it first. Not every hero gets a prophecy. Some walk through life without ever hearing a single whispered verse, without ever feeling the weight of destiny hanging over their shoulders. But others live right next to it, not named, not chosen, but close enough to feel the pull, like heat from a fire you're not allowed to touch. Thalia Grace was one of those heroes, a daughter of Zeus, born into a world where gods had sworn not to have children. She should never have existed. And yet, she did. Wild, angry, brilliant. Her voice like thunder when she was passionate. Her silence even louder when she hurt. She ran from monsters before she could vote. Protected younger demigods before she even knew what a prophecy was. And when the world finally caught up to her, when her choices narrowed, when the end was closing in, she made the one choice the prophecy never accounted for. She gave up her body, not by surrender, but by sacrifice. She let herself become a pine tree, roots instead of ruin, stillness instead of screams. And that moment, quiet as it was, shook the entire timeline, because many believed Thalia was the one the great prophecy had been meant for. A half-blood of the eldest gods, the right age, the right strength, the right pain. But her death, or what looked like death, halted the prophecy in its tracks. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe fate simply turned the page, found another name, and kept moving. Still, the thought lingered. If she had lived, what kind of hero would she have been? When she returned, when Artemis made her a hunter, freezing her age in time, she made another quiet, irreversible decision. She removed herself from fate. Hunters do not age. They do not reach 16. They do not stand at prophecy's edge. In that choice, Thalia stepped outside the story. She became a myth beside the myth. A girl who could have saved the world or destroyed it, but chose instead to carry other burdens, to lead, to protect, to vanish into moonlight and silence. And then there was Nico. Oh, Nico. If Thalia was a storm, Nico was the shadow it left behind. He came from another era, literally. Born in the 1930s, trapped in a Lotus hotel that swallowed time like a dream, he emerged into a world that had already passed him by. A world where his sister was his only anchor, and even she would be ripped away too soon. When Bianca joined the hunters and died on a quest Nico never wanted her to take, something inside him shattered. It wasn't loud. It wasn't heroic. It was quiet. The kind of grief that sits in your chest like a stone at the bottom of a lake. And from that silence came power. Nico was a child of Hades, not just by blood, but in every way that mattered. He spoke to ghosts, summoned the dead, traveled through shadows. He didn't ask for prophecy, but prophecy whispered to him anyway. In graveyards, in lonely corridors, in the space between his footsteps and everyone else's laughter. Some believed he was the one the oracle truly meant, that the great prophecy wasn't about Percy or Thalia, but about the boy no one saw coming. And perhaps, in another thread of time, it was. Nico grew strong, dark, brilliant. He faced the labyrinth when it nearly swallowed him whole. He battled titans in silence. He kept secrets that could have burned Olympus down. And for a long time he walked alone, not because he wanted to, but because the world had no place for him. Not yet. Not fully. His father offered him power, a throne in the underworld, armies of the dead. But Nico refused, again and again. Refused to be what prophecy might have demanded. Refused to become an omen. He never stood at the center of the oracle's attic, never held the full weight of a rhyming curse. But in his heart, he carried prophecies of his own. not written in verse, but in silence, in grief, in the refusal to break. And then there were the almosts, the other shadows. Heroes like Ethan Nakamura, son of Nemesis, who believed the world owed him justice, who might have been a hero, but chased revenge instead. Or Clarice, daughter of Ares, who wore prophecy like a challenge, something to punch through, to defy with every scar. Or Bianca herself, whose death became a turning point, not just for Nico, but for the gods who watched and realized how fragile their children truly were. All of them walked close to prophecy, and all of them shaped it. Because prophecy is not a single thread. It is a web, a constellation. The hero at the center may shine the brightest, but the surrounding stars, those in orbit, those in shadow, are just as important. They catch the fall. They cast the contrast. They make the ending possible. And for Nico and Thalia, their paths weren't defined by how closely they matched the oracle's words, but by how fiercely they carried what could have been. There is a quiet prophecy in choosing not to be chosen. There is power in standing at the edge of fate and saying, I will not be its puppet. And yet, destiny has a way of circling back, of finding those who once walked away. Because later, much later, Nico would find himself wrapped in another kind of prophecy. One not about war, but about healing, about love, about becoming something more than what he was told to be. And Thalia, she still wanders the wilds with her hunters, immortal in spirit, legendary in silence, carrying that echo of prophecy not spoken, but remembered. And so, as the great prophecy fades into memory, and Percy steps into a different kind of peace, the shadows around him still hum, still breathe, because prophecy doesn't just belong to those named. It belongs to those who almost were, to the Thalias, the Nikos, the Biancas, and Clarissas of the world, the ones who nearly held the blade, the ones who carried its weight anyway. And as the world tilts toward a new rhythm, a new dream, a new verse waiting to be heard, it is those shadows that will shape the edges of what comes next. But prophecy in the world of demigods is not only about those who fulfill it, or even those who almost did. Sometimes the shadows reach further, wrapping themselves around forgotten names and roads never taken. There are stories lost in the margins, like Selena Beauregard, daughter of Aphrodite, whose courage bloomed only at the very end, too late for the spotlight, but just in time to change the war. Or Luke Castellan, the boy who was both the sword and the wound, the villain and the savior. His soul tangled in prophecy's roots, even though no verse ever spoke his name aloud. There's something haunting about that, how fate seems to stretch like thread around the necks of those who never asked for it, like thread strung too tight, vibrating with guilt and what-ifs. Because for every prophecy spoken, there are 100 lives changed by its gravity. The prophecy never said Selena would die for love. It never warned Ethan that chasing fairness might cost him everything. It never named Charles Beckendorf, whose last explosion held back a warship long enough for others to survive. And yet, all of them moved like stars around a single sun, the prophecy Percy fulfilled. They lived beneath its shadow, orbiting a truth that was never theirs to claim, but always theirs to feel. Even Grover Underwood, satyr and seeker, bore its weight. He wasn't a child of a god. No monster trembled at his name. But he walked beside Percy from the beginning, saw what others missed, and stood through every quake of prophecy's path. And then there's Annabeth. Wise, sharp, brave Annabeth, daughter of Athena. She never held a prophecy of her own. Not then, not in the age of the first great prophecy, but her hands built the bridges across which others walked. She saw patterns where others saw riddles. She believed in Percy even when he doubted himself. She was not the center of fate's attention, but she was its architect. She interpreted the oracle's words. She chose quests with calm clarity. And when Percy made the choice to trust Luke, it was her voice, steady and certain, that echoed in the space between hesitation and action. Annabeth reminds us that some heroes don't need a prophecy to change the world. Some simply build the future with their hands and stubborn hope. And still, as all these figures weave around the great prophecy, the question remains, what if fate had been different? What if Talia had lived longer? What if Nico had been born in another decade? What if Luke had never been twisted by resentment? These are not just questions. They are dreams. Branches of time that may not have bloomed, but still left their seeds. Because prophecy is not law. It is possibility, a compass, not a command. And when you look back at the tapestry of heroes who stood just outside the oracle's words, you begin to see how wide the influence really spreads. It isn't just about who was chosen, it's about who helped carry the burden, who caught the blade before it fell, who whispered comfort at the cliff's edge. And in that way, the prophecy fulfilled by Percy was never his alone. It was Thalia's, who gave up her mortality to buy time. It was Nico's, who bore the weight of death so others could live. It was Annabeth's, who read between the lines when others only saw doom. Even Clarisse, who arrived late to the battle, but brought rage strong enough to break a god's spine. All of them mattered. All of them added color and shape to a prophecy that could have crumbled into tragedy if left in lesser hands. And perhaps that's the true nature of fate. Not a single thread, but 1,000 stitched in silence, each one waiting to be noticed. And then the attic grew quiet again. The old oracle, her mummified body still and brittle, gave her last words and fell into sleep forever. The house on the hill no longer groaned with prophecy. The voice that had once stirred the air with riddles and doom fell silent. But the world did not stop. The need for vision, for guidance, for glimpses of what may come next did not vanish. The gods watched. The demigods waited. And somewhere, in the noise of battle's aftermath, a mortal girl with red paint on her fingers and dreams in her eyes stepped into the storm. Her name was Rachel Elizabeth Dare. She was not a child of the gods. She had no cabin at camp, but she saw through the mist. She heard things no mortal should. And when the last oracle faded, it was Rachel who walked forward, who let the spirit of Delphi enter her, let it flood her soul with ancient fire, and became the next voice of prophecy. No one expected it. not even her. And yet, the moment she opened her mouth and spoke a new prophecy, one that would echo into a second great war, it felt as if the stars had simply remembered where they were meant to be. A new oracle, a new vision, a new verse. And so, as we leave behind the shadows of those who might have been, we step now into the story of the one who became the voice itself. There was a girl who saw what others couldn't. Not a demigod, not a warrior, not someone trained in battle or prophecy. Just a mortal with wild red hair, eyes like green glass in moonlight, and paint always splattered on her fingertips. Her name was Rachel Elizabeth Dare, and she was ordinary in all the ways that didn't matter, and extraordinary in one way that did. She could see through the mist, clearly, not just glimpses or shadows or flickers of shapes she didn't understand, but fully, always, with unwavering focus. She saw monsters where others saw men. She saw weapons disguised as pens. She saw gods moving behind human faces. And perhaps most importantly, she saw Percy Jackson for who he was, even before he fully did. The first time she met him, it was in a cavernous room, a place of tunnels and danger and panic. But she didn't flinch. She didn't run. She simply looked at him and said, "You drool when you sleep." And from that moment on, her world began to change. She was pulled into something far greater than she could have imagined. A war was coming. Prophecies were stirring. And Rachel, mortal Rachel, kept finding herself in the center of storms meant for gods. Most mortals would have turned away, run, forgotten what they'd seen. But Rachel painted. She painted visions before they came. She sketched shapes she couldn't name, symbols older than Greek, brushstrokes that came from places she couldn't explain. Her hands moved with a rhythm that didn't belong to her, as if her fingers were remembering things her mouth had yet to speak. And the gods began to notice, because at Camp Half-Blood, something had changed. The Oracle of Delphi, the one who had delivered the great prophecy and guided generations of heroes, had fallen silent. Her final words had been spoken. Her ancient body, now brittle as dust, crumbled into true death. And for the first time in ages, the attic was empty. The voice of Apollo had no vessel. The oracle was gone. But prophecy does not die. It only waits. And Rachel, with her mortal heartbeat and immortal clarity, felt that waiting like a hum inside her bones. There were moments when she would pause mid-sentence, eyes glazed over, mouth open, but no words would come. Her friends thought she was distracted. Percy thought she was slipping away, but she was listening. The voice had not entered her yet, but it was circling, watching, deciding. And when the time came, it did not roar. It whispered. It whispered in the darkness of her dreams. It whispered in the white space between paint and canvas. It whispered as she stood at the edge of Olympus, trembling but unafraid. She did not ask to be the oracle. She simply knew it was time. Because prophecies are not only for demigods. They are for those who can carry weight without breaking. Those who do not chase destiny, but stand still long enough for it to find them. And Rachel, brilliant, strange, calm Rachel, was still. And when the voice of the oracle entered her, it did not twist her into something divine. It deepened her humanity. She fell to her knees. Her voice changed. The words came out of her mouth not like speech, but like wind through ancient stones. She spoke the second great prophecy. 7 half-bloods shall answer the call. The moment those words left her lips, the world changed again. The prophecy had not just been reborn, it had chosen. And with that, Rachel was no longer just a mortal girl who could see through the mist. She was the oracle of Delphi. She was the voice between the gods and the children who walked in their shadows. But she did not become some holy, untouchable thing. She still painted, still questioned, still had sharp opinions and louder truths. She remained Rachel, just brighter, clearer, like she had always been made of glass. And now the light finally poured through. And yet, the burden was real. Being the oracle meant she could no longer quest, could no longer be a part of the world the way she had been. She had become something set apart, a vessel, a bridge, the human wrapped in prophecy's fire. And sometimes she was tired, because visions are not gentle. They come in fragments, in riddles, in fear. They curl around her skull like fog, drip through her fingertips like wet ink, and leave her shaking when the visions finally pass. But Rachel bore them with grace, with stubbornness, with the calm strength that had always made her different. She didn't pretend to be wise. She didn't pretend to know everything, but she spoke when it mattered. And when she fell silent, the world learned to listen. And perhaps that is the lesson of Rachel Elizabeth Dare, that prophecy does not need divine blood. It needs vision. It needs stillness. It needs those who can stand in the storm and let the wind speak through them. And so, with her voice echoing across Olympus, the second great prophecy began to unfold. 7 heroes, 1 journey. And the oracle's gaze now pointed not at the past, but at the future. But prophecy, once awakened, does not sleep again. Not entirely. And though Rachel Elizabeth Dare remained herself on the outside, there was something new now humming beneath her skin. It wasn't power exactly, not the kind demigods craved. It was older, wilder, a thread connecting her to something she could never quite explain. A tangle of time, of ancient dust, of voices that had spoken the same warnings over and over across generations. When she slept, she dreamed not of the future, but of echoing caves, marble floors, and olive trees rustling in a wind that no longer blew. Sometimes she'd wake up crying, having glimpsed a face she couldn't name, or a city in flames, or a star chart shifting slowly in the sky. Other times, the visions came while she was painting, her hand moving faster than thought, sketching 7 figures in different colors, different weapons, different fates, always 7, always waiting. And the moment she spoke the second great prophecy, something shifted in the air, like the world had been holding its breath and finally remembered how to exhale. She didn't remember the words as she said them. They never stayed. But Percy and Annabeth had heard. Chiron had written it down. The gods had listened. 7 half-bloods shall answer the call. And though the prophecy was now sealed into history, the lines still shimmered like moonlight on the surface of a lake. Beautiful, mysterious, and hiding something deeper underneath. Rachel became the bridge between two eras, the last witness to the age of Chronos and the first voice of what would become the age of Gaia. But being the Oracle was not a title she wore with pride. It was more like a thread she carried gently in both hands, careful not to pull too hard, careful not to speak too soon. She lived in the big house now, not in the attic like her predecessor, but in a quiet, sunlit room filled with windows and brushes and jars of watercolors. She kept the doors open. Sometimes she joined the camp dinners. Sometimes she wandered the woods alone. But when her eyes turned glassy and her voice deepened, the camp fell silent. Because when Rachel spoke, the future listened, and the second prophecy had only just begun. She didn't know who the seven would be, not at first. Prophecy doesn't work like that. It's not a script. It's a ripple. It takes time. It unfolds slowly, hidden in choices, in glances, in dreams that repeat themselves over and over until they finally make sense. Sometimes she saw flashes, an eagle, a hammer, a golden coin, a bowstring being pulled back until it snapped. Other times she heard music, screams, silence so loud it became a sound of its own. And she waited. She waited as Camp Half-Blood braced itself, as the Roman camp stirred in the distance, as a new war, one far deeper than the last, began to stretch its fingers across the world. And in that waiting, Rachel grew quieter, not distant, but focused. She learned to feel the weight of moments, to know when a decision might echo louder than expected. She would speak little things, gentle things. This path has too much fog. That cabin door should remain closed today. And somehow, they mattered. She never demanded obedience. She simply observed, like the mist itself had made a home inside her lungs. And yet, she remained human, entirely human, fragile in a way that made her courage even more powerful. Because every time a prophecy slipped through her lips, she shook. Every time the future peeked out from the shadows and spoke through her body, she lost something. Energy, clarity, sleep. Being the oracle was never about glory. It was a slow erosion, a service, a surrender. But Rachel chose it. She chose to let the old spirit live inside her. Not because she wanted answers, but because she knew the world needed direction. And when the second great prophecy finally began to unfold, not in one moment, but in 1,000 small ones, Rachel was ready. She saw Percy disappear. She felt the pain when Jason fell from the sky. She knew, even before the camps collided, that this new war would not be like the last. The old prophecy had asked for a choice. This one asked for unity. 7 half-bloods, not just Greek, not just familiar, but mixed, new, fractured, together. And the burden would not fall on one child. It would be carried by 7 hands, held up through mistrust, through pain, through sacrifice. It would not be a story of one blade, but of 7 different weapons, 7 different hearts, 7 different homes learning to beat in rhythm. Rachel could feel it all, like a song in reverse. And though she could not interfere, she watched, not as a prophet, but as a witness, as a friend. And sometimes, late at night, when the stars outside Camp Half-Blood shimmered too brightly to ignore. She would sit at her window and wonder, not what the prophecy meant, but whether the heroes it named would survive it. Because even the clearest vision can't promise peace, only the possibility of it. And now that possibility was in motion. The lines had been spoken. The prophecy had chosen. In far from the big house, in forests and cities and far-off temples, the seven had already begun to rise. 7 half-bloods shall answer the call. That was the first line. Simple, rhythmic, almost gentle, like a knock at the door of destiny. But unlike the first great prophecy, which loomed like a sword overhead, this one unfurled slowly, like fog rolling in over quiet water. 7, not 1. Not a hero burdened by isolation, but a fellowship. A woven thread of souls and swords and secrets, bound together not by blood, but by purpose. And when that line was spoken, the world began to shift again. It didn't begin with war. It began with silence. With Percy Jackson waking up with no memory, far from home. With Jason Grace falling from the sky with a golden coin in his pocket and no idea where he belonged. It began with questions, quiet ones. Who am I? Where am I meant to be? Why does the air feel different, heavier, filled with something unfinished? But Rachel's voice echoed even when she was far away. The prophecy had already named them. Percy, Jason, 2 sons of the big 3, 2 leaders who didn't yet know they were meant to lead together. And as the days passed and the paths of Camp Half-Blood and Camp Jupiter began to stir, the other 5 came into focus, one by one, like stars fading in through the dusk. There was Annabeth Chase, daughter of Athena, not chosen by fate this time, but still central, still burning with clarity and drive. Her brilliance was sharper than any blade, and her heart, so steady, so stubborn, held the group together even when everything else fell apart. She searched for Percy with a rage only love could carve. And when they reunited, it was not the prophecy that made her powerful. It was the choice to keep believing when even the gods had turned away. Then came Piper McLean, daughter of Aphrodite, but not in the way people expected. She wasn't all sparkle and smiles. She had steel in her voice, literally. Her power was charm, yes, but also truth. She could speak a sentence and reshape the moment. But her true gift was seeing through illusion. She knew when someone was lying. She knew when she was lying to herself. And in the quiet of camp, she often wondered whether she belonged on this quest at all. And yet, she always did. Because the prophecy didn't ask for perfection. It asked for presence. And Piper's presence was fire-wrapped in calm. Next was Leo Valdez, son of Hephaestus, a boy who burned on the outside and the inside. He made machines dance. He made jokes when the world tilted sideways. He built things with hands that never stopped moving, as if stillness might break him in half. But beneath the laughter lived grief, a loneliness so deep it didn't have words. Leo was the spark, the builder, the one who made the impossible fly. And when his moment came, when sacrifice kissed the edge of his fate, he smiled through tears and flew anyway. Hazel Levesque arrived from another century, literally, daughter of Pluto, reborn into a world that had forgotten her name. She came with a past that shimmered like cursed gold, a memory of mistakes that did not belong to this lifetime, but weighed just the same. Hazel saw the underworld in ways others didn't. She saw through lies, through time, through the glimmer of wealth that meant nothing in the face of love. And when she stood not as someone seeking redemption, but as someone who already understood it. And beside her, quietly and without need for fanfare, stood Frank Jong, son of Mars, grandson of warriors, a boy who didn't know what shape his future would take. Literally, shapeshifter, protector, soft-spoken. He held his life in a piece of wood, and yet he never let it define him. He was strength wrapped in gentleness, a quiet that did not signal weakness, but readiness. And when he fought for everyone. The final 7, Percy, Annabeth, Jason, Piper, Leo, Hazel, Frank. 7 heroes from 2 camps, 2 cultures, 2 paths. Some knew each other, some didn't. Some trusted easily, others didn't. But the prophecy had named them, not because they were perfect, but because they were necessary. Together, they formed something new, something Olympus had never seen before. Not a prophecy fulfilled by birthright, but by balance, by bridge building, by the possibility of trust. The next line of the prophecy echoed like thunder in the distance. To storm or fire, the world must fall. It sounded ominous. It sounded final. But it wasn't a warning. It was a truth. Because prophecy doesn't tell you what will happen. It tells you what might. It offers a fork in the road. And this one was already forming. Jason, the storm, son of Jupiter, stoic, noble, heavy with leadership, and Leo, the fire, burning with creativity, grief, and an untapped destiny. The line whispered of endings, of one boy's rise and another's fall, of a choice that would reshape everything. But it didn't say how. It didn't say who. It simply waited. And beneath that waiting, the 7 grew closer. Their ship, the Argo II, soared above the world, faster than monsters, louder than doubt. They laughed even when they shouldn't. They fought even when it hurt. They forgave even when they didn't know how. They were not a prophecy made of marble. They were one made of clay, messy, real, cracked in places, but strong enough to hold together. And as the prophecy's lines began to unfold, they were no longer just words. They were choices. They were tears. They were dreams. They were the kind of sleep-deep fate that doesn't shout, but sings. The prophecy did not rush. It stretched across oceans, across temples, across the cracks between gods and giants. It tested them, not through violence alone, but through doubt, through grief, through secrets, and still they answered the call. But prophecies, even those shared by 7, are not light things to carry. They do not become easier just because they are divided. In fact, sometimes they weigh heavier because each hero must not only shoulder their own fears, but also protect the others from theirs. And as the journey continued, the prophecy's weight began to press harder. Trust frayed. Secrets cracked the silence. Percy and Jason, each used to leadership, now had to walk side by side, uncertain where one's voice ended and the other's began. Both were sons of gods who ruled the sky, and yet neither could see past the fog clouding their purpose. Percy, once the center of fate, now felt himself orbiting something larger than even he could understand. Jason, trained in discipline and loyalty, found himself questioning orders, questioning gods, questioning who he was when stripped of titles. And in the space between them, Annabeth, who had always known how to read a battle map, but was now asked to navigate a world without clear borders. Her heart was pulled in too many directions, toward Percy, toward knowledge, toward a whisper in her dreams calling her deeper into something old and forgotten. The prophecy did not just speak of destruction, it demanded movement, it demanded descent. And so, the Argo too soared forward, bound for Rome, bound for Greece, bound for places older than prophecy itself. But before they reached the ruins of giants and gods, they faced trials that no verse had warned them about. A storm inside Piper, of doubt, of loneliness, of wondering whether love was enough to keep her place among heroes. A fire inside Leo, of loss, of the aching question that haunted him. If I burn too brightly, will there be anything left of me to love? Hazel, touched by both death and the earth beneath her feet, began to see visions of things that should not exist. Portals of shadow, illusions of gold, paths once walked by those long dead. Frank, silent and steady, began to wonder how long he had before the stick in his pocket, his life, his fate, turned to ash. And throughout it all, Rachel's words echoed softly behind them. To storm or fire, the world must fall. The heroes did not know what that meant yet, but they felt the tension like a storm brewing behind their ribs. They looked at Leo and Jason with questions they never said aloud. Would it be one of them? Would one rise while the other fell? And what did fall even mean? Death? Betrayal? Something else? Prophecy is never clear until it's already over. But in the waiting, in the breathing between battles, the seven began to lean on each other, not because they were told to, but because they had to. There were nights on the ship when no one spoke, just the wind and the stars. There were mornings when laughter returned for a moment, and someone dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd make it out of this hole. But the prophecy wasn't done. Not yet. There were more lines, more doors to open, and one of them was about Annabeth, a path without friends, a quest into darkness, alone. It wasn't part of the official verse, but it might as well have been. The prophecy was not just about saving the world, it was about what each hero would have to give up along the way. And as their journey brought them to ancient places, Athens, the Mare Nostrum, the temple ruins where Gaia stirred in her sleep, the lines of the prophecy tightened like threads in a loom. To storm or fire, and then to rise or fall, together or divided. Save the gods or lose themselves. And that, perhaps, was the prophecy's deepest lesson, that the battle was not against giants or even Gaia, but against the silence that grew between them, the doubt that crept into tired minds, the pain of wondering, am I the one who won't make it to the end? Because even prophecies shared by seven can feel desperately lonely especially when you don't know whose name was left unspoken at the end of the line. And yet, they kept going, because that is what heroes do. Not because they are fearless, but because they love too much to stop. And in that love, in those whispered promises, those shared nightmares, those quiet reassurances beneath the stars, the prophecy began to shift. Not its words, but its meaning. Because maybe the world would fall. Maybe it had to. But maybe what rose afterward would be better, wiser, softer. Something earned through unity, not command. And it is in that soft hope, fragile as it was, that the prophecy began to bloom into its next form. Not as a verse, but as a test, a descent, a sacrifice. And the fire and storm were no longer just metaphors. They were choices. They were crossroads. And one by one, the heroes began to reach them. Fate does not always strike like thunder. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in a gaze held too long, in a choice made too quietly, in a sacrifice no one else saw until it was already made. And as the 7 heroes walked further into their quest, the prophecy's grip deepened, not with more riddles, but with emotional weight. Their fates were no longer individual paths. They were knotted together, wound tight like vines around the same trembling future. And it was in those quiet entanglements that the most powerful trials began. Not the kind that roared with battle cries, but the kind that whispered when the ship was still, when the stars were blinking awake, when one heartbeat had to trust another or everything would collapse. Annabeth's descent into the darkness beneath Rome was one such thread, thin, terrifying, almost sacred in its silence. Her quest to recover the Athena Parthenos was not just a test of strength, but of soul. The prophecy had not named her. No ancient voice had announced what she would lose. And yet, she knew. From the moment she stepped forward, alone as the prophecy demanded, she knew that this was her thread in the web, a path no one else could walk. She faced her greatest fear in the belly of the earth, not a monster, but betrayal, memory, the ghost of a mother who once expected too much. And through it all, she held fast to one thing: Percy, not as a hero, not as the boy of the first prophecy, but as hers, as the person who reminded her that love was not weakness. It was the reason you climb, even when the ladder vanishes beneath your feet. And Percy, above ground, felt every heartbeat of her absence like a wound. When he finally joined her, when they fell together into the depths of Tartarus, it was not prophecy that saved them. It was love. Raw, exhausted, wordless love. Together, they walked through a place no demigod was meant to survive. They held hands as they passed rivers of pain. They clung to each other as monsters whispered their worst regrets. And in the darkest parts of that cursed pit, they were not heroes. They were 2 souls refusing to break. There is no prophecy line for that. No verse that says they held on when everything else fell away. But maybe there should be, because that's what true fate looks like. Not grand speeches, just quiet survival. Just choosing over and over not to let go. Above, the others carried their own burdens. Jason fought to be more than his title. He had been raised to believe in order, in loyalty, in lines drawn clearly between right and wrong. But the prophecy twisted those lines. It forced him to question the gods, to question why the Romans and Greeks were divided, to ask whether unity could be forged by anything other than pain. And Piper's power came not from battle, but from words, from the voice that could calm storms or stir them. She faced love like a battlefield, never sure if her feelings were her own or written by Aphrodite's will. But through every moment of doubt, she kept choosing Leo, choosing Jason, choosing herself. And when the group began to fracture, it was often Piper's voice that brought them back. Leo burned quietly, always the outsider, always the one laughing too quickly. But his smile was armor. His jokes were shields. He loved fiercely and alone. And when he lost Calypso, when the one person who had seen him beyond the fire was taken from him, he did not scream. He built, he flew, he vanished, because that was his pattern. Love, lose, leave. But love is not a prophecy. It cannot be predicted. It grows in the gaps between battles. It rises in the ashes of grief. And in the end, Leo would fly into death, not because the prophecy demanded it, but because his heart did. He left not knowing if he'd return, not knowing if anyone would remember. But he did it anyway, because that's what love does. Hazel, half dead and fully alive, carried the weight of 2 lifetimes. She saw truths others didn't. She bore the curse of wealth that turned to rot. And through it all, she never stopped loving the world around her. Its chaos, its cruelty, its fleeting kindness. She protected Frank like the earth itself protected roots. Quietly, constantly, never asking for thanks. And Frank, with his fragile life burning quietly in a stick of wood, became something far stronger than anyone expected. He was the shield, the backbone, the choice no one else saw coming. He gave himself fully to the mission, not because the prophecy said he would, but because that's who he was. A boy made of loyalty, a heart made of iron. And when the moment came, when sacrifice stared them in the face, when fate demanded someone fall, it was love that chose. Not prophecy, not destiny, not the gods, just them, each other. And maybe that's the lesson the second prophecy was trying to teach. That fate may write the lines, but love decides how they're spoken. That even when the world must fall, by storm or fire, it can still rise again in something stronger, something softer, a kiss before the end, a hand reached out in the dark, a promise whispered with no certainty it will be kept, but said anyway, because that is what binds the 7, not power, not parentage, but sacrifice. And in that sacrifice, their fates were sealed, not in tragedy, but in the fierce, quiet kind of love that survives even prophecy itself. And so, as the final threads of the prophecy tightened like breath before a fall, it came to the one hero no one had expected to carry the end. Not Jason, not Percy, not Annabeth, but Leo Valdez, the Joker, the Tinkerer, the spark hiding in plain sight, the boy who laughed loudest when he hurt most. From the beginning, Leo had always felt like the 7th wheel. He loved his friends deeply, but from just outside the circle. He watched Piper and Jason share glances he couldn't decode. He saw Percy and Annabeth so fused together by shared battles and old dreams that no one could squeeze in between. He felt Hazel and Frank's quiet gravity, like something beautiful that had no space left to offer. And so Leo, who made the ship fly, who built the Argo II from pieces of sky and broken faith, kept his loneliness folded up inside jokes and whirring gadgets. But he never stopped loving them, never stopped protecting them. And when Calypso came into his life, stranded on her timeless island, angry and forgotten and radiant in her pain, Leo saw something he had never seen in himself. He saw someone who didn't want to be saved, who didn't trust easily, who knew what it meant to be abandoned by prophecy's glare. And he loved her, fiercely, silently. And when the world fell, when Gaia rose, when the final lines of the second great prophecy cracked open like thunder, it was Leo who made the choice. No verse named him. No line said he would be the one to fall. But he knew. Deep down, he had always known. The Storm and Fire line had never truly been about Jason or Leo in opposition. It was about the choice between destruction and renewal. And Leo chose to burn, not in anger, but in hope. He flew into the sky with Festus, with the physician's cure in hand, with a smile that masked a goodbye. He struck the final blow. He ended Gaia's rise. And in that moment, the world held its breath. The battle was over. The earth fell silent. But Leo was gone. And for a while, grief returned. The others, Jason, Piper, Frank, Hazel, Annabeth, Percy, they had won. But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like subtraction, like something vital had been lifted from their chests. And even though Leo had left clues, even though Rachel had painted stars that hinted at his return, the ache remained, because that is the cost of intertwined fate. Not all threads return to the loom. But Leo did return. Not to them. Not at first, but to Ogygia, to Calypso. He fulfilled his promise, not because prophecy said he must, but because love had rooted itself deeper than time. And in that small act, an immortal boy keeping his word to an immortal girl, the cycle of abandonment cracked. And something new bloomed. And so the prophecy fulfilled itself, not with glory, but with softness. The 7 were scattered again. Some returned to camp, some drifted toward other quests. Some tried to rest, though prophecy leaves echoes that do not sleep. Jason dreamed of schools and healing. Piper dreamed of silence. Frank and Hazel dreamed of home. Percy and Annabeth, after so many trials, dared to imagine a future that was just theirs. And Rachel, she watched it all unfold. Her voice grew quiet. Her vision slowed. The prophecy had ended. But prophecy never truly ends. It only pauses. And far from Camp Half-Blood, across coasts and temples, and broken oaths, another voice began to stir. Not Greek, not born from Mount Olympus, but older, stranger, written on scrolls buried beneath Rome and guarded by wolves. Because while the Greeks had spoken in riddles and rhymes, the Romans had carved fate into bone, and those bones were waking. The Sibylline books, the whispers of augurs, the omens cast in bird feathers and spilled wine, and in the golden halls of Camp Jupiter, another future was already writing itself into stone. long before Rachel Elizabeth Dare opened her mouth to speak the second great prophecy, before Leo soared into the sky, before Annabeth and Percy held hands in the pit of Tartarus, there were whispers that belonged to a different tongue, a different rhythm, a different kind of silence. The Romans did not speak of fate in riddles, not the way the Greeks did. They did not lean into mystery and madness. Their prophecies were structured, formal, read from scrolls bound in ashwood and wrapped in iron. Their visions came not from a single oracle on a hill, but from augurs, robed and reverent, who read the sky, the entrails of sacrificed animals, the behavior of birds, the patterns of wind against the shields of sleeping warriors. In Rome, prophecy was law, and it was feared not for its poetry, but for its permanence. They did not ask what could happen. They asked what must happen. And buried deep beneath the old temples, locked in sacred chests, lay the Sibylline books, volumes of prophecy so ancient that even Jupiter, king of gods, read them with caution. They were said to have been purchased by a long-dead king from a woman who burned them one by one until he accepted her price. And what remained, what she gave him, were words that could collapse empires or birth them. And it was from these Roman whispers that Camp Jupiter took its shape, not just as a camp, but as a legacy, a continuation of an empire that never quite died, where Camp Half-Blood was wild and chaotic, a place of heart and poetry and survival. Camp Jupiter was stone and structure, legionnaires, praetors, rule, discipline, and beneath it all, fate carved in columns. At Camp Jupiter, demigods did not ask who they were. They were told, assigned cohorts, given ranks, trained from the moment they arrived to serve not just themselves, but Rome itself. And with that sense of order came a different kind of prophecy. Not one that landed like a curse on a single child's shoulders, but one that filtered down like policy from above. The augurs still watched the sky, still studied patterns, but there was no attic with a whispering mummy, no lone voice. Instead, there was Lupa, the wolf who trained the Roman-born demigods in the wilderness. She offered no riddles, only strength. And then there was Rhena, daughter of Bellona, praetor of Camp Jupiter. She was not born into prophecy, but she became part of it through sheer force of will. Her gaze was steel, her heart carved from loyalty. She understood the Sibylline teachings not as a priestess, but as a leader who knew how easily fate could be used to manipulate the weak. She did not chase prophecy. She respected it. She read its warnings not as poems, but as tactics. And when Jason vanished, when the Greek and Roman worlds began to spiral toward war, it was Rhena who held the legion together. Not through visions, but through presence, through command, through the way she stood, unshaken, even as the old words began to rise again. Because the Sibylline books had not remained closed. Somewhere, deep beneath New Rome, in a vault where torchlight barely touched the walls, new pages were being written. Omens began to emerge. Crows flying backwards at dusk. Statues weeping blood. Earthquakes that shook only temples. Roman augurs began to whisper of the seventh seal, of an old enemy buried not in the west, but in the roots of Italy itself. And then Gaia, the Earth Mother, older than any god, older than Olympus, older even than Rome. The Sibylline scrolls had warned of her return, not as a monster, but as a mother reclaiming what was hers. And the Romans, structured, powerful, relentless, began to feel the cracks in their foundations. Prophecy for them had always been tied to duty, but now it became personal, emotional. Jason had been raised by them, trained by them, crowned by them. And when he vanished, it felt less like a failure and more like a betrayal. The Greek camp, once myth, now real, came into focus, and prophecy turned its gaze not inward, but outward. What happens when two branches of the same tree forget they share a root? That was the question prophecy now asked, not just in verse, but in action, in conflict, and even in hope. Because deep beneath the rules and the rigidity, even the Romans longed for peace. And when Reina felt the tension between camps rise, she chose something unheard of. She stepped beyond Rome, not with a legion, but with a heart open to risk, with a Pegasus beneath her and pain behind her ribs. She became not just a commander, but a bridge. And as the Roman augurs watched the sky darken with signs, as the Sibylline texts began to glow with unread lines, they knew the second great prophecy was not theirs alone. The Greeks had given it voice, but Rome would shape its outcome. But even within the walls of Camp Jupiter, where shields gleamed and banners whipped clean in the wind, prophecy was not always trusted. Respected, yes. Recorded, always. But deep down, many Romans feared it, not because it lied, but because it never left room for escape. The rituals of augury were solemn, ceremonial, untouched by emotion. The augurs rose before dawn, eyes lined with ash, lips pressed in silence, and climbed the Temple Hill steps to watch the horizon. They released birds in pairs, eagles for Jupiter, doves for Venus, owls for Minerva, and read their flight paths like they were letters from the gods themselves. A loop meant hesitation. A sharp turn east meant warning. A shadowed path, omen. But no one ever asked the birds where they wanted to go. That was the Roman flaw, reading every sign, but never questioning who sent them. And so the Sibylline scrolls continued to grow, layer upon layer of interpretations, updated by scholars, guarded by magic, impossible to destroy. They were the voice of an empire that refused to die. And in the shadows of that voice stood Hazel Levesque, a daughter of Pluto reborn in a century that did not recognize her face. Her existence alone was a breach in fate, a soul who had been dead and yet lived, tethered to the Roman world by accident, by sacrifice, by love. Hazel could feel prophecy in the ground, not through rhymes or stars, but through bones. She walked above graveyards and felt names long buried whisper beneath her boots. The Roman dead did not dream. They waited, ordered, filed. And when Hazel passed, they sometimes stirred, expecting her to join them again, or command them as their rightful heir. She hated it, but she carried it, because that's what Romans do, even when their name has been lost, even when the gods forget where they buried you. And in the deepest part of her, Hazel remembered the whispers of her first life, the prophecy that had cost her everything, the one that never came true, The vision that said her mother's greed would buy them a kingdom, that riches buried beneath New Orleans would make them eternal. But all it bought was misery. Hazel had died for that lie. And now, in this second life, surrounded by scrolls and augurs and prophecies carved into marble, she walked with the quiet wisdom of someone who had already paid the price. She didn't trust prophecy. She trusted people. Frank, steady and warm. Leo, broken but trying. Percy, older than his years. Annabeth, sharp as glass. She didn't need a verse to tell her what love looked like. She saw it in how they fought, how they forgave. And when the prophecy pulled her across oceans, back to Greece, into battle after battle, she held one truth closer than any line spoken from Rachel's mouth or Rome's scrolls. Prophecy is not a promise, it is a possibility. And sometimes it's wrong. Because beneath Camp Jupiter, in libraries no camper had touched in years, in dusty annexes beneath New Rome's Senate building, sat scrolls that no one read anymore. Predictions that had failed. Lines that were supposed to end in disaster, but never happened. Wars predicted in 1957 that never arrived. A flood that never breached San Francisco. The rise of a demigod emperor who never drew a sword. These were the lost prophecies, the forgotten ones. Not because they were erased, but because they didn't fit. And the Romans, so strict, so structured, so obsessed with order, had quietly moved them aside. But fate, even when ignored, leaves fingerprints. And now, as the camps rejoined, as Reyna crossed oceans to bring peace, as Jason questioned his loyalty, and the seven fulfilled their quest not as soldiers, but as friends, those forgotten prophecies began to whisper again, not in rhyme, not in flame, but in memory, in silence, in doubt. Because what happens to a prophecy that never comes true? Does it die, or does it wait? And in that question lies the path to what comes next. Not every prophecy comes true. That is the truth no augur wants to say aloud, no oracle wants to whisper under their breath. But in the long history of gods and heroes, not all fates unfold the way they were foretold. Some wither quietly, others stall mid-sentence, and some are rewritten entirely, not by magic, but by something far older, far more unpredictable, human will. The gods rarely speak of these failed prophecies. To them, fate is supposed to be fixed, a tapestry already woven, threads pulled by the Moirai or the Parquet, depending which pantheon you're listening to. But what the gods often forget, what demigods sometimes remember, is that even the most ancient thread can fray. That choice, however small, can unravel a destiny spoken in gold. These are the prophecies that never came true, the ones lost in the spaces between battles, the ones silenced before they could become real, the ones that were supposed to happen until they didn't. There was a prophecy once that a son of Poseidon would destroy Olympus, not with war, but with silence, that he would turn away when the gods cried out for help, and in doing so, let the heavens fall. It was never officially recorded. It was seen in dreams, passed through whisper networks in Olympus, hinted at in Athena's nightmares. But Percy never let it happen, not because someone stopped him, but because he loved too much to stand still. That was the first failure. A prophecy undone not by death, but by mercy. Another warned of a daughter of Ares who would bring about the next Titan war by spilling ichor on sacred soil. Clarice LaRue was watched like a hawk for months. But when the time came, she chose differently. She waited. She listened. She grieved. And her grief bent the outcome just enough to change the path. The war came, yes, but not through her hands. And so, another prophecy folded into silence. In the Roman records, locked away in scrolls too old to unroll without gloves, there is mention of a stormbringer born of Neptune and Jupiter, whose twin souls would tear the earth in half. For a time, Jason and Percy were thought to be this match, rival suns, conflicting skies, and yet, when they met, they didn't clash. They cooperated, awkwardly, painfully at times, but they did. They turned prophecy into something else, into friendship, into learning, into trust. And the earth did not split. That too was a prophecy that failed. Then there are the ones never spoken aloud. The ones scribbled by minor oracles, half mad with visions no one believed. A prophecy that the Athena Parthenos would one day fall again, not to battle, but to love. A verse that claimed Leo Valdez was never meant to return from his final flight. And yet, he did. He found his way back from death, with Calypso by his side, defying every expectation, because he wanted to, because he couldn't leave promises unfinished. And so, even death, so often wrapped in prophecy, was not the end. Even the mist, that ancient veil that shields mortals from myth, has its own broken verse. There was once a belief that a mortal who could see through the mist would bring madness to the gods, exposing them to the mortal world, unraveling their hidden dominion. That mortal was Rachel, and yet she became their vessel instead, a friend, a guardian of truths, not a destroyer, but a light. So what happened to all these failed prophecies? Where do they go? Some say they sleep, curled like autumn leaves in the pages of forgotten scrolls, waiting for another moment to become true. Others believe they vanish like smoke once their path is blocked. But maybe they live on, not in words, but in possibilities. Echoes, dreams that drift through the heads of demigods who never quite understand why they feel so heavy at dawn. Maybe they become something softer, a reminder that the future is not always fixed. That even when fate is written in divine ink, choice can still smudge the line. There's something strangely peaceful in that. The idea that even the worst prophecy can be bent, not erased, but softened, like a melody that fades into silence instead of finishing with a final chord. It gives hope and fear. Because if prophecies can fail, they can also surprise. There are those who fear this truth, gods who cling to their control, demigods who would rather know than wonder. But the ones who've walked through fire, the ones who've watched prophecy change mid-step, know better. They know that fate may give you the script, but it's up to you to decide if you say the lines. That's why these unspoken prophecies matter. Not because they were right, but because they remind us that wrong is possible, that defiance is divine. And maybe, just maybe, that's what scares the gods most. Not monsters, not titans, not even the Earth Mother herself, but mortals who refuse to play their part. Heroes who look fate in the face and say, no. And if those heroes walk away from prophecy, if they step off the stage before the final act, if they choose a new path carved by love or grief or stubborn hope, then those unspoken verses drift into a different kind of power, not lost, not failed, but freed. And now, as the scrolls lie quiet, as the seven return to lives half normal and half echoing, there is a breath, a space, a pause before the next verse. And in that pause, those failed prophecies hum, not loud, not angry, just present, like static, like fog, like dreams that hover in the corners of our sleep, waiting. And still, some of the most powerful prophecies never came from the gods at all. They came from nightmares, from stories passed down through cabins and cohorts, whispered between bunk beds long after the campfires burned out. Predictions made not by oracles, but by fear itself. A camper would mutter that children of Hecate always vanish before their second quest, that children of Hypnos never wake from battles, that no child of Nemesis ever finds peace. None of it carved into scrolls, none of it recorded, but believed all the same. And those kinds of prophecies, the unspoken ones, are sometimes the hardest to break. Because when a story is repeated enough, it becomes law. It settles into the skin. It turns expectations into chains. But even those were broken. Lou Ellen survived her second quest. Clovis from the Hypnos cabin learned to control dreams instead of getting lost in them. And a son of Nemesis named Ethan Nakamura, who once believed he could only exist in opposition, died not with vengeance on his lips, but with doubt in his eyes. And even doubt is a kind of freedom. There were more. Prophecies never fulfilled because someone made a different choice. A child of Athena who decided that intelligence didn't have to mean cruelty. A daughter of Ares who chose art over war. A son of Hermes who gave back what he once stole. Each one a tiny rebellion. Each one a soft refusal. And the world shifted inch by inch because of them. These were the futures that unraveled quietly. No monsters, no explosions, just someone stopping mid-sentence and deciding they didn't like how the story was written. And so they rewrote it. And somewhere in the mist, the broken lines of prophecy glimmered, no longer warnings, but reminders. That fate is not always a map. Sometimes it's a question. Will you follow the path, or will you make one of your own? The most dangerous prophecies are not the ones that come true, but the ones that never had to, because they reveal that the gods are not always in control, that mortals, demigods, dreamers, can carve reality with nothing but stubborn hope and a little time. And perhaps that's why so many old prophecies were buried, not because they failed, but because they were defied. And even defiance has power. There is a certain peace in knowing that not every future is fixed, that some verses simply drift into the stars and never return, that some battles never come, some doomsdays miss their mark, that love can interrupt destiny and friendship can change a war. And sometimes silence is the loudest answer. That is where the last of the forgotten prophecies live, not in scrolls, not in temples, but in the quiet acts, in the hands that chose to heal instead of strike, in the hearts that held on when they could have let go, and in the footsteps of those who walked away from glory, from prophecy, from fate itself, just to live, to breathe, to rest. And now, as all these voices begin to fade, the spoken ones, the broken ones, the ones that never found their ending, the world begins to exhale. The oracles fall silent again. The scrolls are rolled shut. The ink dries. And in the stillness that follows, a final whisper drifts through the dusk. Not a new prophecy, not a riddle, just a breath, just a reminder that fate is not a cage, it is a door. And you, yes, even you, have the key. And so, we turn now to the closing pages, to the hush that follows every verse, to the quiet that remains when all the battles are over, the choices are made, and the future waits patiently for your next step. Come, let us listen one last time. The story is almost over now. Not the story of heroes and gods. Those go on forever, whispered in wind and fire, passed down through starlight and dreams. But this story, the quiet one you've followed tonight, the story of prophecy, of what it means to be told your future before you've even begun to live it. And as we drift gently toward the end, the voices begin to quiet, not because they are gone, but because they've been heard. Because every prophecy, whether fulfilled or forgotten, is just a message meant to be carried. And you've carried them now. You've walked through the attic where dust clung to the oracle's bones. You've flown with 7 half-bloods over oceans and ruins. You've heard Rachel's voice echo through silence. You've watched fate twist and fray and soften beneath the weight of love. And through it all, something beautiful has happened. Not loudly, but slowly, gently. The prophecies have become a little less frightening, a little less final. They are no longer distant forces carved in marble. They are memories. They are choices. They are you and the way you've listened, the way you've stayed. And that brings us here to this final whisper, this soft exhale at the edge of the myth. There are no monsters here, no riddles, no deadlines, just stillness, just the fading golden threads of stories you now know by heart. Perhaps you've noticed it already, that the most important lines were never the ones chiseled into stone. They were the ones whispered in darkness, the ones spoken between two friends who weren't sure what tomorrow would bring, the ones shared in quiet, aching moments when love chose to stay behind. Percy never asked to be chosen. Annabeth never needed prophecy to be wise. Leo didn't wait for a sign to make his final promise. Rachel never demanded to be the oracle. These were all choices. And now, with the prophecies behind them, the heroes sleep. Maybe not forever. Maybe not peacefully every night. But sleep all the same. And so can you. Let the old verses settle. Let the words that once carried fire dissolve like stardust in the air. You don't need to hold them anymore. You don't need to carry the weight of what could happen, what should happen, what almost did. Tonight, there is no fate to fight, no future to fear, just the soft sound of your breath, steady and slow. Inhale, exhale, let go. Even the gods, ancient and restless as they are understand this feeling. The quiet after war. The pause after prophecy. Apollo himself once lost his voice. Even he had to relearn silence. Even he had to surrender to the hush. And if the god of oracles can sleep, so can you. Picture it now. The big house attic is empty. The mists have cleared. The scrolls are closed. Camp Half-Blood is quiet, save for a single canoe floating on the lake. A breeze tugging softly at the sail. Camp Jupiter's torches flicker low. The augurs have gone to bed. The stars stretch overhead, not as signs, but as company. No one is watching. No one is waiting. The world is simply still. This is where prophecy ends. Not with an explosion, not with a crown, but with calm, with peace, with the knowledge that whatever story you carry, you are allowed to rest in it. You are allowed to not know. You are allowed to simply be. And maybe, just maybe, that is the final whisper. The one no oracle speaks aloud. The one no scroll records. You are not what was predicted of you. You are what you choose to become. And if tonight you choose to become someone at peace, someone who lets the stories fade like waves into shore, then that is enough. That is everything. You have walked through every echo, every verse, every shadow dream, and now all that's left is quiet. Stay here a little longer. Let the breath be slow. Let the stars above hold your story for a while. The future can wait. And now, with the stars high and still, and the last of the old verses fading into air, there is nothing left to chase. No battle to relive. No fate to decipher. Just the slow realization that maybe prophecy was never meant to tell the future. It was meant to help us listen, to slow down, to feel, to trace the shape of fear and find something gentler inside it. The gods, for all their power, have always been afraid of the unknown. That's why they clung so tightly to prophecy, to maps, to riddles, to scrolls inked in permanence. But mortals? Mortals are brave in quieter ways. They wake each day with no oracle. They choose without knowing. They love without guarantees. And the demigods, the ones you've followed through these stories, they were never just half-bloods. They were half brave, half heart, half hope, half fire, half storm, half steady hand. They were always more than the verses written about them. And perhaps that's the final secret the fates have always tried to keep hidden, that even the threads they weave can be cut, tied elsewhere, or simply left to trail off into new stories. Because maybe that's the gift of prophecy, that it can end, that it doesn't need to follow us forever, that it can drift into memory like mist across a lake, leaving behind only clarity and calm. The oracle's voice has gone quiet now. The attic in the big house is dark, but no longer haunted. Rachel sleeps in her studio with fingers smudged in charcoal, dreaming not of verses, but of starlight pressed onto paper. The Sibylline scrolls are locked away once more, untouched by fire, undisturbed by war. And the seven, they are scattered like constellations, some home, some wandering, all changed, not by prophecy, but by what they chose when the lines didn't tell them what to do. And if you're listening closely, if your breath is steady, if the night is soft around you, maybe you can feel that peace beginning to wrap around you too, like a blanket of unspoken endings, like the hush that comes when the story is done, but your heart is still humming with what it meant. Because this wasn't just a story of what happened. It was a story of what could have happened, what didn't, and what still might. And now it no longer belongs to the gods. It belongs to you, to your quiet thoughts, your secret fears, your hopes that rise like fireflies at the edge of sleep. Because prophecy doesn't need to rhyme to be real. Sometimes it's just a feeling that you are exactly where you're meant to be, even in the stillness, even in the dark, even now. And so, before we drift into the final page, before we say goodbye to the oracles and the scrolls and the echoes of what could have been, I'll leave you with this. The final whisper is not from them. It's from you. The you that keeps listening, that keeps dreaming, that keeps choosing, even when no one tells you what comes next. And that whisper, that quiet, steady whisper, is the beginning of something new. Not a prophecy, but peace. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening. Whether your eyes are still fluttering open or already halfway to dreams, know this. You've made it all the way to the end. Through the myths and the mysteries, through the fates and the failures, through every prophecy ever spoken, and every one that never came true. You followed Percy through storms. You stood with Annabeth in silence. You watched Leo burn and fly and return. You heard Rachel's voice as it opened the future, and Raina's strength as she carried peace between worlds. You stood with Nico, with Hazel, with Piper, with Jason. You sat beside gods who feared time and campers who defied it. You held each verse softly in your hands, and somewhere along the way, you stopped trying to decode fate and simply let it be what it was. A story, a rhythm, a dream. And now, in this gentle space at the end, you don't need to carry anything anymore. Not the names, not the battles, not the lines. Just let them go. Let them melt like candlelight, slow and golden, and kind. You've done enough. You are enough. You are not a prophecy. You are a person, a soul, a breath beneath the stars. And if nothing else remains with you from this long night of legends and whispers, let it be this. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to not know. You are allowed to lay down every question, every prediction, every plan, and simply drift. You are not late. You are not behind. You are not broken because your path isn't clear. Even the heroes were uncertain. Even the oracles paused. Even the gods lost their way. But rest always finds its way back. Just like you did. Just like you are, right now. In this quiet moment where no monsters are chasing you, no battles need fighting, and no futures need deciding. This is your time. No more quests. No more clues. Just the sound of your own breath. Inhale. Exhale. Easy now. You've traveled far, not through space, but through story, through emotion, through memory. And here, at the edge of it all, the path doesn't end. It opens. And maybe tomorrow, you'll carry forward something small, a feeling, a line, a face, a flicker of courage that stayed with you. But tonight, you carry nothing. You float. You rest. You let the last words tuck around you like a blanket. The stars above Camp Half-Blood still shimmer. The firelight in New Rome still glows. The wind moves softly across the hills where heroes once stood. But they are not fighting now. They are sleeping, just like you will in a moment. And if you hear a whisper before you sleep, don't worry. It isn't prophecy. It isn't fate. It's simply peace, arriving like a tide. Let it take you. Let it hold you. Let it tell you without words that you are safe, that you are loved, that you are already exactly where you need to be. Thank you again for walking with us, for dreaming beside us, for listening with an open heart. And now it's time to say goodnight. Gently, slowly, with no rush to reach the end, because the end has already passed you, and the only thing left now is rest.